was this gentleman, Bennett Cerf, who was co-founder of the New York publishing firm Random House. Now, Green had distributed copies of the manuscript to 9 book publishers and asked them to bid on the opportunity to publish the book, something that had never been done before, according to Cerf. Now, just the day before he received Tregaskis' work, Cerf had been talking with his colleagues that the first book to come out about Guadalcanal would be a knockout, because Guadalcanal marked the turning of the tide of the war in the Pacific, which of course had been going badly for the Allies since the Japanese had bombed the American fleet at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Cerf received the manuscript from King Features on November 11th, took it home with him, read it that night, and called Green at 9 o'clock the next morning and told him, I've got to have this book. Please Cerf related years later that Random House had signed up to publish the young reporter's work before any of the 8 other publishers had even started reading it. His premonition that the American public would be interested in learning more about the Marines and their pitched battles with the enemy forces on a remote island thousands of miles away turned out to be quite accurate. Rushed into print on January 18, 1943, Guadalcanal Diary became a national bestseller and the first Random House book to sell more than 100,000 copies. Critic John Chamberlain of the New York Times wrote that Tregaskis' book served as a tonic for the war weary on the home front, showing as it did to the Japanese and those who doubted America's resolve that a country doesn't necessarily have to love war in order to fight it. Sales were also helped in November 1943 when 20th Century Fox released a movie version based on the book. Although unknown in the publishing world, Tregaskis had already made a name for himself through his work with the INS. He had followed American forces early on during the desperate days of fighting in the Pacific. Before his experience on Guadalcanal, he had been on the scene and written dispatches for INS member newspapers about some of the main turning points for the American Navy, including watching from a nearby cruiser, the USS Northampton, as Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led his force of Army B-25 bombers off the deck of the aircraft carrier Hornet to bomb Tokyo on April 28, 1942. After the Doolittle raid, Tregaskis had boarded the Hornet and remained with the carrier's officers and enlisted men as they attempted but missed out on joining other American carriers at the Battle of the Coral Sea early in May 1942. He remained on the Hornet for its next foray into the Pacific and saw the carrier's planes take off from the wooden flight deck to seek further revenge for Pearl Harbor against the Japanese at the Battle of Midway. Of course, a smashing victory for the U.S. fleet. In his daily interactions with the ship's crew during routine operations and also under fire, Tregaskis came to learn more about their attitude about the war and death, which he discovered were very sane and matter of fact, as each man might have had his life ended at any day at sea, either by the enemy's doing or by routine accidents. I had seen some of our flyers virtually drunk with excitement immediately after their first experience in the maelstrom of actual combat, he recalled. But I was to find that such oft-repeated matters as being locked below decks while there was action above, or sailing through waters thick with submarines, or witnessing accidents, or losing one's best friend in battle, can be routine when repeated often enough. After Midway, in fact, and an accident in which a number of Hornet's pilots have been killed, including every member of Torpedo Squadron 8 except for one man, Ensign George Gay, the gentleman at the right there. Tregaskis had been startled when gathered for dinner that nobody mentioned the empty chairs at the table. Instead, the conversation revolved around the usual unimportant matters. But when I reflected on the matter, I could see that silence was probably the sensible approach. Covering the Doolittle raid in Midway represented an impressive achievement for an inexperienced war correspondent hired by the INS shortly before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Tregaskis had also just learned from his doctors that he suffered from diabetes, a family illness, and had been turned down for service in the war. Working on the late shift on the rewrite desk at INS's New York office, he had become so despondent about his failed contributions to the war effort that he'd even considered taking his own life. He rallied, however, and sadly to his assignment as an INS war correspondent assigned to cover the Pacific Fleet. After all, he reflected, the closer he came to getting killed in this career, the better my story would be. That is, if he survived. Born on November 28, 1916 in Elizabeth, New Jersey, Tregaskis was the second child and first son of Archibald and Maud M. Ostrom Tregaskis. Maud, whose family came from Germany and included a long line of scholars and teachers, said that her children were both excellent students and stood at the head of their classes each month with very few exceptions. Archibald, originally from England, made his living as the head of the editorial department for the Singer Manufacturing Company, of course, which produced Singer sewing machines in a factory on Elizabeth's outskirts. As a boy, the young Tregaskis had been a keen reader, drawn, he remembered, to many warlike sagas of the past, including the story of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, Spain's legendary El Cid, and the Scandinavian hero Beowulf and his battle against the monster Grendel. All these characters, he noted, were brave men at war for ideals in the past. And as a schoolboy, always bigger than the others of his age, he had resented the dumb battle with the bullies who picked on the smaller boys at his schools. His interest in journalism started about the age of 15. He had attended two private institutions in the area, the PD and Pingree schools, and he helped his parents, who were strapped for cash due to the effects of the Great Depression and Archibald's poor health because of his own diabetes, by paying for his education through winning scholarships, working as a student waiter, and writing short articles about sports and other school activities for newspapers in New York City, Trenton, and Newark, New Jersey, and also newspapers in Philadelphia. He got more of his articles into print and therefore made extra money by using various aliases. He received scholarships from such groups as the Harvard Club of New Jersey and was able to accept admission to the freshman class at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1934. Now, throughout his life, Tregaskis loved swimming. And there's an interesting story about his time at Harvard. He and another student were competing for the last spot as a backstroker on the Harvard swim team. And Tregaskis won a match race against this young man who happened to be John F. Kennedy, who of course later became president of the United States and had served ably in the Pacific during World War II when his PT-109 was struck by a Japanese destroyer, and he swam for most of the night, towing some of his crew members to safety. But Tregaskis later said that both of them were not the best swimmers at that time, so he was lucky to win a spot on the Harvard team. At Harvard, Tregaskis studied English literature, history, government, and economics. He always had an eye on a future career in journalism. He believed that possessing a broad sweep of information was important to a writer, and more so than probably in any other profession. A nonfiction writer, especially, he said, should know something about almost every subject because his article assignments may carry him into many highly specialized fields, and without a basic knowledge, he's apt to be sorely handicapped in his research. After he graduated from Harvard in June 1938, he got a job as a feature writer for the Boston Advertiser. His schedule at the newspaper included 4 days of writing feature articles and a double day of news reporting and also doing rewrite on other stories. He said he covered all the beats, including the waterfront, the state house, the federal building, police headquarters, and courthouses, which was a valuable experience for any reporter at any newspaper. In the early 1941, he got a job with the International News Service. Now, the INS was not American journalism's preferred wire service. It ran a poor third to the top two, the Associated Press, and at that time, United Press. And although scorned and often badmouthed by both, noted longtime INS reporter and syndicated columnist Bob Considine, we were some of the proudest people in the news business. They were proud, he said, despite being outmanned by the other wire services when they were asked to cover a story. Tregaskis himself was ready and willing and able when called upon by his editors to serve overseas in the Pacific and cover operations there for INS. Standing approximately 6 feet 5 inches tall, later I'll talk about some of the difficulties in actually tracking down his real height. Tregaskis had been warned by many friends before going into action that the Japanese, if they did not kill him, would capture him and use him as an observation post. But he left Guadalcanal relatively unscathed, except for a bout with malaria. He considered himself an unlikely type to be a war correspondent because of his height, his thin frame, and poor eyesight. But he risked his life at the front out of a double sense of duty to his country and to the men who fought on his behalf. He was also driven by an insatiable curiosity to uncover the stories of those who were enduring combat. His willingness to go where the action was impressed all who came upon him. One soldier told him, "How you guys go ahead and stick your necks out when you don't have to?" "Well, it just beats the hell out of me." And he had a simple answer, "But we certainly have to. That's our job." His luck finally, let me go back. Oh, go back here. There we go. His luck finally ran out when he was accompanying Allied forces during the invasion of Italy. On November 22nd, 1943, after observing U.S. Rangers battling Germans on Mount Corno near Cassino, Italy, he was returning to headquarters to write his story when a German shell landed near him. Shrapnel struck and pierced his helmet, lodging in his brain and causing partial paralysis that robbed him for a time of his power to speak, read, and write. He said this: "They carried me out with the hole in my skull the size of a soup spoon and bone and steel fragments embedded 2 inches deep in my brain." He worked his way through the states and 6 Army and Navy hospitals. Finally, a metal plate was put in his head at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C., but he went back to the fighting front. Before he did so, he received a Purple Heart from the military, produced a second book, Invasion Diary, detailing his time covering the invasions of Sicily and Italy and his near-death experience on Mount Corno and his recovery from his wounding. Throughout all these difficulties, he tried to keep his sense of humor. When one of his friends visited him at Walter Reed, Tregaskis asked him to do him a favor. "Sure, anything," the friend responded. He said, "Before they put the metal plate on, take a look inside my head and see if my brain is still there." The friend obliged and confirmed that the brain was where it should be. "Fine," said a relieved Tregaskis. "I might have to use it someday." He even joked with the doctors performing the operation, asking them if the metal they were putting in his skull was bulletproof. Unfortunately, it was not. A recovered Tregaskis caught up with American forces in the summer of 1944 after a successful breakout from the Normandy beachhead. And he did notice a change in his attitude after his experience in Italy. I was aware of a new and dreadful sensitivity, he said, to the dangers of war, an acute, nervous state that made the sounds of incoming shells or enemy machine gun fire crushing and unbearable. His nerves continued to be what he called shaky as he made his way across France, Belgium, Holland, and into Nazi Germany itself. He decided to put himself to the test by participating in the battle to capture the city of Aachen, Germany, alongside a frontline unit with the Army's 1st Division. If he survived, he knew he would be equipped with a new set of nerves and probably a good story too. He immersed himself into a perilous form of warfare, street fighting. Let's go back here. A task that he described in the article for the Saturday Evening Post as the bitter, exasperating block by block and house by house struggle, which develops when war sweeps through thickly settled communities and the enemy is determined to make a fight of it. He could not get Aachen out of his mind after returning to the United States. He was seized with he called a fever to write something about that battle. And in a couple of months of frenzied work, produced a novel, his first fiction, titled Stronger Than Fear, which he dedicated to the valor of the infantry, the soldiers without armor who are the vanguard of every attack. The book detailed the experience of a captain named Paul Kreider, who fought his somehow who fought his own battle with fear during intense fighting in a city that he named Unterbach, a stand-in for Aachen. The writing of the book was a hard struggle, he said, but when it was over, I felt that I had distilled the central truth of life at war and perhaps of even life in general. The truth was that when you are faced with a mortal fear, which demands the deepest kind of courage, and you can find that courage, you have won life's most important battle, the battle for self-respect. Tregaskis could have remained safe back on the home front, but editors of a national magazine asked him to return to the Pacific to follow the crew of a B-29 bomber as it prepared for missions against Japanese cities. He was asked by an editor at this magazine, the Saturday Evening Post, "Do you really want to go?" And without hesitating, he gave an answer I think that any reporter who covered World War II would understand. I don't want to go, but I think I ought to go. So he went. Tregaskis was one of the approximately 1,800 men and women who worked as combat reporters, a job that he once described as an outsider with special privileges during World War II. He never in his career as a correspondent sent home a rewrite of a headquarters communique, said Considine, one of his colleagues. He didn't believe in communiques. He had to see for himself. He was one of those reporters who had to be at the front lines and seeing with his own eyes what was going on. Robert Sherrod, who was a war correspondent for Time and Life magazine and covered the Marines in the Central Pacific during the war, said, he, Powell, Tregaskis, and others did not want to be seen as what he called communique commandos, always staying behind the lines at headquarters company and getting press dispatches from officers well behind the lines. They had to be at the front to see for themselves. Tregaskis knew from personal experience which of his colleagues would not be content with merely taking information from military headquarters. They would make their dispatches as accurate as possible. They would make the exhausting, fatiguing journeys up to the various division headquarters, even the progressively smaller units to regiments and battalions and even companies, each step growing increasingly dangerous, yet more productive of getting the real facts as the distance from the enemy grew smaller and smaller. He recognized such reporters as Don Whitehead of the Associated Press, Russell Hill of the New York Herald Tribune, and George Hicks of the radio's Blue Network. All of these men possessed the courage to go up and get the material themselves, as well as having the guts to write about what they uncovered honestly, even with the constant demand from their editors for sensational headlines. The best correspondents, Tregaskis added, stuck to the facts even when it hurt, when a less principled rival might twist the story into a fake to make it a better story. Tregaskis had often pondered why he and others risked their lives to report on the war. He said that good correspondents, like other people of action, were generally unwilling to make themselves heroes, but most will admit that they take chances in war zones for the same reasons the mountain climber gave when asked why he wanted to scale Mount Everest, because it is there. Although AP reporter Hal Boyle once joked that all you needed to be a war correspondent was a strong stomach, a weak mind, and plenty of endurance, he and his colleagues were aware of the dangers that they faced. Despite the death and disabilities that went hand in hand with war, Tregaskis said there was another facet that drew people, whatever their personal persuasion or sex. And he called it the instant elimination of personal ambition in favor of unselfish sacrifice to a greater cause. Never mind that the fact that the cause is the destruction of an enemy and the expenditure of resources, including life and health, to destroy something the foe considers highly valuable. He did acknowledge that war could be exciting as anything in life. After the war ended, he worked for a time as a screenwriter in Hollywood and later for television programs. Also served as a roving worldwide reporter for True magazine. He finally settled in Hawaii and found happiness after his many travels with his third wife, who you see here, Moana, who often accompanied him on his travels, serving as his photographer. You can see her at bottom with him in Vietnam. The two spent considerable time in South Vietnam in the early 1960s, and Tregaskis interacted with American advisors in the field and produced another well-regarded book, Vietnam Diary. Before his death at age 56 from a heart attack while swimming in the Pacific Ocean on August 15, 1973, he returned to the island that had made him famous, Guadalcanal. Roaming the battle sites on the island, Tregaskis saw that the jungle appeared to be almost always the same. Any swipe at the tangled green mass unearthed rusting war machinery, everything from airplane parts to spent ammunition, as well as the remnants of the men who'd fought there, including some bleached white skulls. But to Tregaskis, it did not matter if the jungle continued to engulf the foxholes and shells and rusting guns and tanks. It doesn't matter if the jungle looks as savagely pristine as it did before, just so long as the same vigor and guts and bottomless springs of ingenuity, devotion, and humor continue to characterize our fighting men. And that's the story of Richard Tregaskis, a bit of the story contained in my book, Richard Tregaskis, Reporting Under Fire from Guadalcanal to Vietnam. It was published by the University of New Mexico Press on November 15th. It's available directly from them as well as other online retailers. And I'll be happy to answer any questions you have about how I came to write about his life and times, or my other books.
I'll kick one off. In reading his book, Guadalcanal Diary, I don't detect any sarcasm, and yet it seems like in real life he had a penchant for using sarcasm. Did you detect any in his writings?
I did a bit. He was often sarcastic when facing, I think, the inanities of war sometimes. But he did have, I think, at the start, somewhat of a romantic view of the war. He talks about talking with Robert Capa, the noted World War II photographer, who had covered the Spanish Civil War and had seen war before World War II. And they were in North Africa awaiting the invasion of Italy. And Tregaskis was expounding on his view that, in war, the man next to you would, do anything for you, give his shirt off his back to you if you needed it. And Kappa was a little more cynical about warfare. He said, yes, he agreed that yes, war can be exciting. So I think as time went on, as he was wounded, he saw war more realistically. But I think he always put the fighting men on a pedestal in all of his writing, from Guadalcanal Diary, Invasion Diary, the book Stronger Than Fear, and later on in Vietnam as well. And he was put at odds sometimes in Vietnam because he was also working alongside some younger war correspondents who did not, who treated what their information they were getting from the government officials there, more pessimistically than Tregaskis would have liked. And I think there's just a different way of looking at war. He realized that Vietnam was different from World War II. In World War II, there was a confirmed battlefront. You knew where the front lines were. Whereas in Vietnam, as he said, as someone told him, a French reporter told him, the war is everywhere.
If anybody has questions, you have to unmute your microphones. Well, if there are no further questions, then I want to thank Ray for an interesting presentation there. And Ray, I'm going to send you an email to follow up on a few things.
Sure.
All right. So I thank you all for attending, and I will send out an email for the January lecture, which is supposed to be from, pop in a minute. But anyway, I'll send out an email and we'll get that going. So thank you all for attending.
Richard, one last thing I wanted to, I mentioned something about, Tregaskis's height. He'd been 6 feet 5 inches tall.
Oh, right.
Now, one of the interesting aspects of doing my work on the book, in going through his papers at the Gottlieb Archival Research Center at Boston University, and also at the American Heritage Center at the University of Wyoming, were all these various articles about him over the years, and each article seemed had a different height for him. One article said he was 6'6". Someone else later on said, oh, he was 6'9". He was the tallest war correspondent in history. And so you can never pin down one exact height for him. So I had to depend on his official war correspondent identification card from the government that listed him as 6'5" tall. And there's a photograph in my book of him standing next to General Mark Clark in Italy. And Clark was, I think, 6'3", and Tregaskis, you can see, is a little taller than Clark is. So I think I was pretty accurate that he's 6'5" tall. That's some of the perils of being a biographer these days.
I don't know. When you go to college, do they record, do they record that kind of information on any level, like your health record or?
I'm sure there are. I don't remember anyone asking me how tall I was when I went to Indiana University. They might have during his time at Harvard.
Preliminary medical something you have to fill out. So maybe that.
Yeah, I would think so.
Curious. Yeah. But anyway.
Yeah.
All righty. Well, again,
I have a question.
Go ahead.
My question is, when he was covering the Doolittle raid, where was he located?
He was with the task force on the cruiser USS Northampton. That was part of the final ships that made the run toward Tokyo.
Part of the convoy.
Part of the convoy, the task force. And so he was on the deck of the Northampton watching the Hornet as the planes took off. And he wrote some dramatic articles about his experience, but unfortunately, they didn't appear until a year after all this had taken place, because a lid was put on there were various correspondents on the task force, but all their stories were, blocked until a year later. And in fact, when they were eventually published in newspapers across the country, they were titled as his Hornet Diary, because of course he had become famous with a best-selling book, Guadalcanal Diary. So all his material that he used for writing Guadalcanal Diary, his notebooks, his big black book, were confiscated by the U.S. Navy because they just contained so much secret material. And he was kind of chagrined at one point when they excised. He mentioned that the Japanese encampments he came across on Guadalcanal had a sweetish odor to them, and the Navy censor cut that out. And Tregaskis wondered, well, what did they expect, that the Japanese would get this information and start wearing deodorant or something to mask their camps? He just couldn't believe some of this little detail that probably would not give information to the enemy was cut out of his final manuscript.
Did he have an opportunity to interview any of the raiders or any of the people on the
No,
Hornet?
he did not. He wasn't on the Hornet with the flyers from the Doolittle team. He was on the Northampton during the whole
But later he
mission.
never did?
I don't think he ever did. And I never had the chance. Of course, he talked to the crew of the Northampton, and they were just stunned that they got away with it. They couldn't believe that they were able to launch all the planes and get away safely. They were always worried about being under attack by the Japanese fleet or Japanese submarines.
It is pretty amazing. I went to the last 5 Doolittle Raider reunions, so I've been around the Raiders a lot. And I asked Dick Cole, Colonel Cole, was he worried when he was taking off, because he was the co-pilot with Doolittle. He says, I had the best pilot in the world sitting next to me. He said, I wasn't worried. So
well, they needed all the skill they could. Yeah, if you look at the photographs from the planes taken off from the Hornet, the seas were very, very rough, and the waves were breaking up over the carrier deck. It was just unbelievable. They got off. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much. I enjoyed your presentation.
Yes, and don't forget, his book is available on Amazon. So it's an interesting read. Please take a look at it. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to log us all off now.
Thanks,
and I hope
Ray.
everyone had a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you, Ray.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye now.